Before I tell you where and when this case took place, I would first like to introduce you to the sponsor of today's video, June's Journey. I've mentioned June's Journey on the channel before as a fantastic game, but if you haven't heard of it, it's free to download and set in the 1920s, where you look for clues and objects in a series of different scenes, which are beautifully crafted, and using what you found, you try and piece together who murdered June's sister. During the game, you play as June, going through all the twists and turns of the case, and you even have a mansion and garden island that you expand and customize as you progress in the game. I always enjoy playing to relax after a long day, and it's so satisfying discovering new clues and watching my mansion grow. It makes me feel like I'm in the game. Make sure to click the link in the description or scan my QR code and download June's Journey for free. June's Journey is available on Android and iOS mobile devices, as well as on PC through Facebook Games. Now let's go to mid-19th century England. Francis Turner was born in 1843 in the market town of New Romney, in the picturesque county of Kent. Although the town was small, it had a rich heritage and a quaint charm. It sat on the edge of the Romney Marsh, an area that served primarily as agricultural land. It was used for grazing livestock, particularly sheep, which thrived in the fertile pastures. Farmers also cultivated crops, such as wheat and barley, on the reclaimed farmland within the marsh. Additionally, the land provided resources such as reeds for thatching roofs and clay for brick making. Frances was from a large family. She attended the local school, but when she was old enough, her parents sent her to the town of Folkestone, a distance of 15 miles, to work in domestic service. Folkestone was experiencing a period of growth and development, driven by its strategic location as a major port and seaside resort. Its picturesque cliffs and sandy beaches made it an attractive destination for tourists, and the arrival of the railway in 1843 had further facilitated access to Folkestone, which helped to increase economic activity and tourism. The town became an important transit point for travellers en route to continental Europe, and the construction of the harbour increased the number of steamship services to France. Despite its growing popularity as a holiday destination and importance as a port, Folkestone retained its traditional character, with fishing and shipping playing significant roles in the local economy. The town also boasted a thriving community of artists and writers, drawn to its scenic landscapes and maritime atmosphere. Frances grew into an attractive young lady, and when she was not working, she liked to walk along the promenade, where she would often be approached by gentlemen keen to make her acquaintance. However, her parents and her employer were shocked when in 1864 she announced that she was with child. The father was a gentleman named Mr. William Kidder, a potato dealer who was some 15 years her senior. At the time, unmarried mothers carried a certain social stigma, but despite the societal whispers and speculative gazes, Frances faced impending motherhood with a serene determination. She gave birth to a daughter, who she named Emma, and shortly afterwards, on the 1st of February 1865, she and William were married. However, unbeknown to Frances, William carried a past fraught with complexities. She discovered that he had fathered 2 illegitimate children from a previous relationship, something that she certainly hadn't anticipated. The mother of these children was a lady named Miss Eliza Staples, who had sadly passed away, and it had been arranged that one child would reside with the deceased lady's parents in the village of Sellinge, while the other, an 8-year-old girl named Louisa, would be placed in care of another family. However, when Mr. Kidder failed to meet the required weekly maintenance payments, the child was returned, and the young girl came to live with him and his new wife in Hythe. Many describe Louisa as a quiet, polite child, but she would now have to adapt to a life living in a small house alongside her father, stepmother, and half-sister Emma. From the very beginning, the relationship between Louisa and her stepmother Frances was fraught. While it was customary during the 1860s for parents to administer stern punishments to discipline their children, Frances displayed much cruelty towards the young girl. Not only did she subject her to relentless physical abuse, She also forced her to wear tattered clothing and frequently withheld her food. Furthermore, Louisa was sometimes banished from the house, regardless of the weather, and made to sleep in the bleak confines of the cellar, with only sacks for comfort. The cruelty that Louisa endured transformed her from a once vibrant and happy girl into a withdrawn and despondent child, her spirit dimmed by the harsh treatment administered by her stepmother. The behaviour of Frances prompted a neighbour, a man named Mr. William Henniker, to report her to the authorities. Consequently, she was placed in front of a magistrate, facing charges of cruelty, and was punished by a fine. Louisa was then placed under the care of a guardian for her own safety. However, William again failed to fulfil his financial obligations towards her, resulting in Louisa coming back to live with her father, stepmother and half-sister. Louisa's return reignited Frances's animosity towards her, leading to a resurgence of cruelty. Tensions escalated between William and Frances as he began to confront his wife about her treatment towards his daughter. On at least one occasion, the conflict escalated to the point where William expelled his wife from their home. Louisa's torment was compounded by the inadequate protection provided by her father, Mr. William Kidder. Neighbours would witness what was happening in the house and see the sadness in the young girl's eyes, but it was never again reported to the authorities, allowing the mistreatment to persist unchecked. But Frances also suffered abuse at the hands of her husband. In Victorian England, a husband's violent outbursts would cast a shadow over many households, with women bearing the brunt of physical and emotional violence behind closed doors. Society's strict gender norms and legal constraints often left these women without recourse, trapped in a cycle of suffering, in a society where discussing domestic matters openly was uncommon, and where victims found themselves isolated and unable to seek help or support. Frances was involved in assisting her husband in his potato dealing business. However, their lives took a distressing turn in July 1867 when she sustained serious injuries in a harrowing accident. While travelling in their horse-drawn cart, an unexpected mishap occurred. As the horse bolted, this resulted in Frances being thrown off, and the impact was severe, leaving her with injuries that doctors believed may have affected her brain. She was recommended a period of rest to aid her recovery. Despite this ordeal, Frances's resentment towards Louisa persisted. On Saturday the 17th of August 1867, Frances, accompanied by Louisa and her own daughter Emma, went to visit her parents in New Romney. They would all be staying there for about a week, as Frances was still recovering from her accidents. 8 days later, on Sunday the 25th of August, Frances informed her parents that she wasn't feeling well, so said that she would prefer to remain in the home with the children instead of joining them for a walk. However, once her parents had left the house, she asked her brother and sister if they would look after Emma, as she and Louisa would be going to attend a nearby fair. She then told Louisa to change out of her best Sunday clothes and put on a dress that looked old. When Louisa had done this, they set off towards New Romney. It was not until 10 p.m. that Frances returned to her parents' house, but Louisa was not with her. By now it was dark. Frances's mother heard a knock at the door and let her in. However, Mrs. Turner couldn't help but express her surprise that her daughter had returned alone. But before she could voice her concern, Frances looked at her and said, "Oh, Mother, I am so wet. I am wet through." Mrs. Turner looked at her and then inquired about Louisa. With a cold expression, Frances just turned her head and, pointing, she calmly said, "There," but Louisa was nowhere to be seen. A little while later, William arrived to collect them, but when he realised that Louisa was not there, he became very concerned. He asked his wife about the whereabouts of his daughter, but Frances offered few answers, only hollow excuses. She seemed uneasy, her eyes avoiding William's piercing gaze. She retreated to her room and was immediately followed by her father, who saw on the floor the clothes that she had worn that day. They were discarded in a heap, very wet and dirty with mud. He stood for a moment in shock, fully aware of Frances's history of cruelty towards her stepdaughter. His concern prompted him to tell William, and the two men set off to inform Constable Aspinall. The constable accompanied them back to the house, where Frances was seated in a chair, her face solemn and her demeanour somewhat subdued. Constable Aspinall started to talk to her, but she simply stared blankly at the floor. He persisted with his questions, but her answers stumbled and faltered under the scrutiny of the law. Her feeble attempts to explain Louisa's absence seemed increasingly implausible. He then asked her the unthinkable question: did she murder her own stepdaughter? After a few minutes, Frances began to tell a tale of a tragic accident that had occurred near Cobb's Bridge. She said that Louisa had stumbled into a deep ditch after being startled by passing horses. She said that she had tried to get to her, but was unable to. Instead, she screamed for help, but no one heard her cries. Although not convinced that this story was true, the primary concern for the constable was the well-being of the child. He assembled a search party made up of a few officers and volunteers, most of whom had been drinking in the local pub. Together they searched the countryside for any sign of the missing girl. It did not take long for a group of men to come across the lifeless body of a child, who was identified to be 11-year-old Louisa Kidder. The discovery sent shockwaves through the community, shattering the fragile peace of the small town. An inquest was hastily arranged that was held in the Ship Inn. It was a harrowing affair, each testimony an incriminating indictment of Frances's guilt. In the end, the verdict was that poor Louisa had met her demise at the hands of her own stepmother. Frances was led away to await trial in the Kent Spring Assizes in the town of Maidstone. The 40-mile journey to the prison proved agonising, requiring a stop in the town of Ashford, so Frances could take a brief walk, her anguish evident for all to witness. When she reached the prison and was placed in a cell, she sought refuge in the counsel of the chaplain, Reverend W. Fraser. Through his guidance, she found a semblance of peace, a flicker of hope amidst the darkness that surrounded her. Meanwhile, beyond the prison walls, there was talk of betrayal and scandal. It was said that Frances's husband, William, had found comfort in the affection of one of her younger sisters, 18-year-old Adelaide. This revelation added a bitter twist to the tragic saga that engulfed them all. The trial of Frances Kidder commenced on the 12th of March 1868 in the Kent County town of Maidstone. It was presided over by Mr. Justice Byles. With the aid of her court-appointed barrister, named Mr. Channell, Frances faced a prosecution armed with evidence which highlighted the continuous mistreatment that she had inflicted upon Louisa and the previous threats that she had made against the young girl. However, testimony from the local doctor, who had conducted an examination of the deceased child at the Ship Inn, revealed drowning as a cause of death, but he said that he had found no evidence that she had been attacked or held down, and that there were no signs of physical violence on her body. Constable Aspinall informed the court that Louisa had been discovered in very shallow water, no more than 2 feet deep, and from which a child of her age may have easily escaped from. Neighbours testified of how they had seen the cruel way in which Mrs. Kidder had treated her stepdaughter, highlighting the occasion that they had seen the young girl with cuts on her face and blood on her pinafore. Witnesses added that Mrs. Kidder openly expressed her dislike for her stepdaughter and constantly mistreated her. Throughout the trial, Frances's defence lawyer, Mr. Channell, endeavoured to sway the jury by suggesting that some witness accounts against his client might have been exaggerated, although strangely, he did not really mention the injuries that she had sustained in the horse and cart accident that happened when she had been assisting her husband, and failed to show the court how this could have had a detrimental effect on her overall health. Strangely, he also did not really emphasise the testimony from the doctor that indicated the absence of visible signs of violence on Louisa's body. Despite the mounting evidence against her, Frances remained steadfast in her defence. She maintained that both she and Louisa were terrified by the horses, which ultimately scared Louisa enough that she fell into the water. She asserted that she valiantly attempted to rescue the child, but failed to reach her. Although no one had seen Frances commit the crime, there were witnesses who told the court that they had heard the defendant speak about ridding herself of the girl. One named Mrs. Burwell told the court that she had heard her telling her husband, Mr. William Kidder, that she would poison the child. Even more damning evidence was delivered by one of Frances's own sisters, a young lady named Mary, who told the court that on the day that Louisa died, Her sister had told her that the young girl would not be returning to Hythe, as she was going to see to it that she didn't. Frances refuted every accusation levelled against her. In her testimony before the court, she recounted the tragic events that led to Louisa's most tragic demise. She told of how the child had been running along the bank when she was startled by two horses, which caused her to tumble into a nearby ditch. She recounted her desperate attempts to rescue her, only to find herself unable to do so. She added that it took a while for her to get out of the ditch, and when she did it was dark. She said she ran back to her parents' house, but saw no one en route. However, Frances also revealed to the court the harrowing abuse she endured from her husband. She told of her unwavering dedication to their family, saying that she had always ensured that William, Louisa and Emma were cared for, and that Louisa attended school, dressed in clean clothes. She added that despite all her efforts, her husband seized every chance to berate her and fabricated falsehoods to discredit her character. She described his relentless abuse, which eventually drove her to report him to the authorities. However, she stressed that this only resulted in his animosity towards her intensifying. When all the evidence had been presented, Mr. Justice Byles meticulously dissected the case. He went over each piece of evidence and provided detailed instructions to the jury. He emphasised the importance of granting the defendant the benefit of the doubt if any uncertainties lingered concerning the largely circumstantial evidence presented against her. But despite the judge's thorough guidance, the jury reached a verdict after a mere 12 minutes of deliberation. They found Mrs. Frances Kidder guilty of the murder of her stepdaughter. Throughout the trial, Frances had displayed a keen interest in the proceedings, but surprisingly, despite the gravity of the situation, she remained remarkably composed when Mr. Justice Byles sentenced her to death by hanging. With an air of resilience, she calmly walked unassisted from the dock, displaying a steadfast resolve in the face of her impending fate. She was then placed in her cell in Maidstone Prison to await her execution. While there, she told the chaplain that she had indeed murdered Louisa, although she claimed that it was not premeditated. At 12 p.m. on the 2nd of April 1868, Frances Kidder was led across a prison yard towards the gallows. A crowd of approximately 2,000 spectators had gathered to witness the event. With assistance from warders, she ascended the steps to the platform, her trembling hands grasping onto the beams. Amidst the solemn atmosphere, she prayed, her final words a plea for mercy, "Lord Jesus, forgive me." The trapdoor then opened, and Frances Kidder was hanged. Following the execution, she was buried in an unmarked grave within the prison grounds, her final resting place, a sombre testament to the tragic event that had unfolded. I would like to once again thank June's Journey for sponsoring this video, and make sure to download it by clicking the link in the description or scanning my QR code. Hello everyone, and thank you so much for listening. As usual, please leave any comments or feedback you may have, and I hope to see you all again in the next brief case.